So I was reading this great Talk of the Town piece in the New Yorker last week. It was about Judd Hirsch visiting his old stomping ground in the Bronx. It was just a perfect piece. It was smart and funny and breezy, but also packed with information. So it made total sense when I got to the byline and saw it was written by today's guest, Michael Schulman. He's a staff writer for the New Yorker and a great cultural observer. His new book, Oscar Wars, is a treat. It's really popcorn, for anyone who loves movies and Hollywood history. Michael, welcome to At Lunch.
Hi.
Hi, are you there? Great. Hi, nice to see you. So let's start at the beginning. What gave you the idea to write this book, and why did you want to write it?
I'm a longtime Oscar fan. I started watching when I was 11. And this book really came out of a New Yorker piece that I worked on in 2016, 2017. I was writing a long piece about basically how the Academy was navigating the aftermath of Oscars So White. And I went out to Hollywood and talked at length with the president of the Academy at the time, Cheryl Boone-Isaac. She was the first Black president, and she was really the face of this diversity initiative that they were pursuing and getting a ton of backlash. It was really divisive in Hollywood, and it was playing out against the backdrop of the 2016 presidential election, which also had a lot of, animus over race and political correctness, et cetera. So I just thought it was a really juicy moment to write about what the Academy is and what their past is like, what their future is like. And so I wrote that piece. Then a week later, I went to the Academy Awards to cover it in person for the first time for the New Yorker. And that was the year of the envelope mix-up with Moonlight and La La Land. So I'm sitting in the press room, I'm like totally wide-eyed, like, oh, I'm here at the Oscars. And this happens. And that moment when they showed the card for Moonlight, everyone screamed. It was like something was really happening. And to me, having observed this whole contentious year, it was like this amazing twist Hollywood ending on this year of racial reckoning. And the fact that Moonlight won, regardless of, the crazy way in which it won, really felt like it was a turning point. Like it reflected this change in American life and culture and politics. And so that really gave me the idea of writing a book about the Oscars that wasn't just a catalog of every single year. Those books exist like encyclopedias, basically. But to just choose about a dozen turning point years and tell the story of what happened, a year that in a way that told a larger story about change in American culture.
Yeah, I love the way you structured the book, because I'm going to just show it again so people will know. You're going to be able to see in the chat how to order it. It's really a lot of fun. Shameless promotion here. But I did love the way you structured it, because, when I told a friend that I was reading a book about the Oscars, they kind of rolled their eyes. Oh, really? That's what you're reading? And I said, what's so interesting about it is that it really says a lot, just as you've indicated, just to how you decide to read the book. It indicates a lot about what's going on in the culture at large. And so if you could just sort of give people an idea of how you picked those moments, because that's got to have been quite a task.
I mean, honestly, that was so fun. I had 9.5 decades of history to look at and just find the really juicy stories to tell. And basically, so I basically had 3 criteria for choosing which years or categories or whatever would become a chapter, one out of a dozen. And the first criteria was I wanted it to be spread out over time, so roughly 1 per decade. Otherwise, I would have written 5 about the 70s, because a lot of crazy stuff happened in the Oscars in the 70s. And secondly, I wanted to choose years that had movies or people that still resonate. I didn't want to be too obscure. So for instance, there's a chapter on the Best Actress race of 1951, which has Bette Davis in All About Eve, Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard, Judy Holliday, Born Yesterday. Like these are movies that people still watch and know. And then thirdly, and most importantly, I wanted to tell a story that had that opened up some bigger resonance, where it was whether it was about Hollywood changing or American life changing or just the Oscars, or it had some great personal story to it. So for instance, there's a chapter on the Best Picture race of 1976, which is, first of all, an incredible lineup. So that second criteria is through the roof on this one. It was the 5 movies were One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Dog Day Afternoon, Nashville, Barry Lyndon, and Jaws. So, I mean, those are incredibly important classic movies, but there's something weird about that list, which is that you have 4 kind of auteurist, anti-authoritarian, new Hollywood 70s movies, and then you have Jaws, which is very different. It's the first modern summer blockbuster. It was directed by this 20-something kid named Spielberg. And on that Oscar night, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won all the 5 major awards. It was one of only 2 movies to do that in history, others being It Happened One Night and The Silence of the Lambs. So it was a gigantic victory for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but Jaws kind of pointed the way to Hollywood's next phase of blockbusters and the 80s and Spielberg being a gigantic player. So just in telling the stories of those 5 movies, how they were made, how they were received, and then how they all collided at the Oscars that year, I thought told a story about, this shift of kind of the new Hollywood of the 70s becoming the glitzy money Hollywood of the 80s, which I know you know a lot about, Julie.
I do, but what's amazing to me is you say that it sounds so like, oh yeah, of course, it was 1976 and these 5 movies and blah. But I know from being on your end of this process, it doesn't just fall into your lap like that. So just really I guess this is just the nerd in me, but I really want to know, like, how in the world did you even figure that out? Did you literally go through year by year and look at what the movies are? Did you have a wise person who you talked to?
I have a whole shelf of Oscar books, and one of them is this book called Inside Oscar, which, it's this edition's from the 80s, I think, and it just has like 6 or 7 pages on every year, and it's before Wikipedia and Google existed, like this is how people looked up what won. And so it's a very different book than we need now, but it was really helpful. And I just sort of paged through. So for instance, I needed a chapter for the 40s, and I just didn't have one and didn't know enough about the Oscars of the 40s. And I remember the day I was reading this book, Inside Oscar. And when I hit 1942, I realized, okay, 3 very dramatic things happened in this one year. One is that Citizen Kane famously lost. In fact, it lost everything except one award for screenplay. Number 2, the awards were held 2.5 months after Pearl Harbor. And so you had America was suddenly at war, and it was all playing out through the Oscars. And there was this wonderful subplot of Bette Davis being the Academy president and quitting in a blaze of glory over how the Oscars should adapt to wartime. And then number 3, 2 sisters who hated each other were nominated for Best Actress against each other, and one of them won. This being Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland. So I thought, okay, you have these 3 really rich stories that tell about the era, about a milestone movie in Hollywood history, and that has this kind of gossipy edge to it as well. That is like, so it'll be fun. So I just thought that had the perfect package for a year. So that's my 40s year. My 40s chapter.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And, one of the things that obviously you talk about in your book, and is a theme like, oh, people don't watch the Oscars anymore. Every year the numbers go down, blah, blah, blah. And yet everybody seems obsessed with them, even though supposedly nobody watches them. I don't know if that's even true. But I guess, well, first of all, just you were talking a little bit before we started the show that just what your experience has been with interest in your book and what kind of response you've been getting from really all over the world. And then if you just talk a little bit, having been so immersed in this history, how do you see the Oscars now? I mean, we'll talk about Will Smith later, but just as a phenomenon, what do you think they're telling us about this moment they're in, even with people not watching them anymore, supposedly, or lying about watching them or whatever?
Well, I mean, 10 million people in the US watch them still. That's a much smaller number than, 30 years ago, but it's still a pretty big audience.
Right.
I mean, what I was saying earlier is just that from my own experience has been like, I've been hearing from like Swedish public radio wants to talk to me about the Oscars, and like, everyone a lot of media swarms around the Oscars every year. So they never really go out of style in terms of press coverage. But I do think that the Oscars are struggling with a crisis of relevance. And it's not really their own making. I think that a lot has changed about the role that movies in general play in our lives. There isn't this monoculture anymore. Our pop culture is very fragmented. I mean, just in terms of the ratings for the show, it's a lot harder now to get everyone in the world to watch one thing on ABC on a Sunday night versus, 1999 or 1998. I was thinking that was the high watermark, the year that Titanic won, and 55 million people watched. So that has changed. And then, the movies are not really at the center of mainstream culture in the way that they were. Even if you look at the Best Picture nominees this year, you have these big blockbusters like Avatar, The Way of Water, and Top Gun Maverick. And those are the movies that people are still going to theaters for. Everything else, they wait for streaming. And a lot of the movies that have come out this year that feel like Oscar movies, like The Fabelmans and Tar, Women Talking, they haven't really ignited at the box office because people aren't going to movies in the same way. And you don't have that stuff in the middle that used to kind of glue the Oscars to mainstream popular culture. Like if you think back, movies like Kramer versus Kramer, Terms of Endearment, Forrest Gump, the kind of adult dramas that are the mid-budget studio movies with big stars in them, and they don't have superheroes in them, and they're not sequels, but they're also not like weird little indie movies. That middle has sort of been taken out of the structure of Hollywood. And so every year now when the Best Picture list comes out, you have people scratching their heads saying, I haven't heard of these. And I don't think that's the Oscars, again, like they are just nominating what people like, but they don't have that guaranteed sort of centerpiece in what people are watching. A lot of people are watching, honestly, TV,
Yeah. And somebody asked a question from the audience sort of related to this, saying TV ratings are collapsing. Will the ceremony no longer be on TV, or does it need to change to survive? Because one of the things that's interesting about watching it as a viewer is, it used to be when I was a kid, you watch it to see everybody in their fabulous clothes, and it was so glitzy and glamorous. And now it's sort of like, it's hard to feel what the there is, kind of. And have people talked about that when you were talking to people about the book, about that? Or
yeah, I know, for sure. And I don't know, I think that there's always this sort of like armchair, people trying to direct the ceremony and saying, oh, the ceremony, they should make it shorter, they should make it cooler, they should go on TikTok, like whatever. They should hire this person to be host. They should not have hosts. Like everyone has an idea about how to fix the Oscars. And I have my personal little wish list of what they would do, but I don't think that's going to change the ratings. I don't think it's going to matter because of all the bigger factors that I talked about before. I think they should just do what they want and make it a great show. And maybe that means that at a certain point, they won't be on ABC. Maybe they'll be on Netflix or something, but it's really hard for me to say. It's a problem for the Academy because they make most of their money selling the rights to ABC.
yeah.
So that is a sort of big headwind that they're up against. But I don't know, as I was finishing the book, it did occur to me, like, is is this the history of something that is in some sense over, which is the glorious first century of the Academy Awards? And what is will there be a full second century of the Academy Awards? And will it mean the same thing?
You know, it's so terrible as you say that. I feel really sad, even though I think it's so dumb, but you just feel this, yeah, because it was a moment. I mean, I think it's interesting. So if you talk about how it reflects our culture, part of it is those moments of everybody doing the same thing at the same time hardly exist. So you said you have your own wish list for what it would be. What's on your, so if you were producing it, what would you want it to be?
Okay, well, I really want them to put the Lifetime Achievement Awards back on the telecast. They took them off about 14 years ago. They now do them at the Governor's Awards, which is a separate event. And I always thought that, you know, when you have like those speeches, when you have some living legend come out, they really always acted as like an emotional centerpiece. Like, you know, I read about the 1970 awards when Cary Grant came out, and he hadn't been at the awards for decades. And he was, you know, this aging Cary Grant who still had this sparkle, and he had a kind of authority like to him. And, you know, they do that at the Golden Globes, and it's, you know, it's always really fascinating when you have these, you know, big people come out and give like a like a career capping speech, like if it's Oprah or Meryl Streep or something. I don't understand why the Oscars are letting the Golden Globes do that and not them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think that what you're talking about is that is the glamour. That's what people want, you know, to have some connection to this history and these people. And ironically, now it's probably easier than ever to actually look at those old movies. If you want to do a Cary Grant Film Festival, you can just do it.
And these are not obscure, you know, oldsters no one's heard of. Like, they just gave a Lifetime Award to Samuel L. Jackson recently. Like, who doesn't want to see a Lifetime Achievement speech from Samuel L. Jackson?
Yeah, no, exactly. So you said it a little bit earlier that you started watching the Oscars when you were 11, and you dedicate your book to your parents, which I think is very nice. I like that. But you could talk a little bit about your growing up and how important or not important, not just the Oscars, but at least the movies were to your family. And we are at the American Jewish Historical Society. So if you could also talk about if you think that there's any connection to your being Jewish and the career path you've taken as somebody who's so immersed in popular culture.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Manhattan, and really my parents brought me to Broadway shows all growing up. And that's how I got so interested in theater. You know, I was seeing Broadway shows from when I was like 6. You know, I remember seeing Cats and Starlight Express in the 80s, and I became a huge Sondheim fan. And I think that really shaped my interest in show business. I was always a movie lover too. My parents tell me I just watched The Wizard of Oz nonstop for like the first 5 years of my life. I was really fascinated by the Muppets. They really shaped my sense of humor. So I was always like a really into culture, and I was the kind of kid who was not into sports. I was into comedy, movies, Broadway shows, etc. I mean, obviously, you know, Upper East Side of Manhattan, this is a very Jewish milieu. There was overlap with show business. Like I don't come from a family that has anything to do with show business, but, you know, for instance, my mother works at nursery schools, and she was the principal of a nursery school growing up that where like Michael J. Fox and his kids, and you know, Woody Allen and Soon-Yi sent their kids there. So I was sort of like right on the edges, kind of looking in, and like had these little brushes with people in Hollywood that excited me. But I'm going to show you something. I have a little Easter egg behind me that I'm going to show you now, Julie. This is a picture of my grandmother with Betty Davis.
Oh my God. Wow. What was that occasion?
This was the only thing of hers that I wanted to inherit. So my grandmother, Doris Lee, very beautiful woman, she was involved. The story she told me was that she was involved in ORT, the Jewish fundraising organization. And in
Yeah.
some 50s, like Betty Davis did something for them, like helped them with something. And so she is presenting her with thank you flowers backstage at some sort of stage show. And you know, my grandmother was a very glamorous woman who loved going to the beauty parlor and dressing up. And she lived till 99. And at her memorial, we talked about how she kind of puts Betty Davis to shame. And she was also like a big flamboyant personality. So I feel like they kind of belong together.
I love that. Oh my God. Well, you know, you talked a little bit before about the chapter in your book about the Oscar race with All About Eve, which was just such an incredible, it's a very alive, very fabulous chapter about, you know, I mean, that's one of my all-time favorite movies anyway, but it was just so great, that whole Oscar race. And I love that you had that personal connection to her via your grandmother.
I know, yeah. I wish I'd gotten to meet her, but Betty Davis has a recurring role in the book because she's really fun to write about. She's always fighting with someone.
Yeah, exactly. Oscar wars.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
and that picture is up right next to my other grandparents' wedding picture. So this is like grandparent alley, except it's like it's like my ancestors are like grandma, grandpa, grandma Betty Davis.
So you were destined for this. You were destined for this career, whether you wanted it or not. Tell us just a little bit about the cover, which I really do love. You said it was kind of your concept. How did that? I
Oh
think
yeah,
it's so great.
isn't it great? So so when we first started talking about the cover, wait, I'm going to bring up another image. Basically, the first thing I told HarperCollins was, I do not want to see a black and white photo of like Elizabeth Taylor holding an Oscar, because that's every other Oscar book. And this book is not about glamour. It's not about elegance. It's about people fighting. It's about conflict. So that's when I had this idea, how about like a bunch of people who are featured in the book reaching for the same Academy Award? And I gave them a list, and I also gave them, I'm going to hold this up to the screen, this classic movie cover.
Oh God, that's what, yes, it's a mad. Oh my God.
Yeah, so you see this, I mean, I don't know if people remember this movie. It's about all this star-studded cast, and they're all looking for the same buried treasure. And so this classic poster has them all sort of reaching for the same bag of money. And I said, let's do that with these people and an Oscar. And they hired a wonderful illustrator named Agata Nowiska, who's Polish and lives in Brooklyn. And it's absolute perfection. I love it.
It's great. I love it too. It's really, really good. So I know you finished this book. I think when we talked a few months ago, you had said you had actually finished the book before the Oscars, but then the whole Will Smith, Chris Rock thing came up, and you did manage to get it in there in the afterward. So I think people have this idea like, oh, isn't that exciting? Michael gets to go to the Oscars. He's there in his tuxedo and mingling with Meryl Streep. So if you could tell people the way you describe it in the book's great, tell them what it's like to be an actual reporter at the Oscars, and especially at that Oscars last year. Tell us what happened, what it was like.
I've been to the Oscars, I think 4 times. I'm about to go for my 5th. And 2 of those 4 times, something completely crazy has happened. The first time I was there was the envelope gate, and then this past time was the slap. So there's a very big difference between going to a normal ceremony and going to one of those. And the reporting is different too. So I write this kind of diary, Oscar night diary of my night. And I try to do it in a very talk of the towny way. So it's like just, I wrote about the time I'm such a New Yorker, I tried to walk to the Oscars and like wound up in this sea of humanity behind a chain link fence next to a woman holding a sign that said Hollywood elites eat babies. Just like, I try to make it like a big sprawling narrative of just like, what if like, someone who, it's like being a stranger in a strange land. And then, so last year I was on deadline for the book. I had taken my sweet ass time. It was a year late, but they said you have to get it in February so we can start the ball rolling to get it out for next year's Oscar season. And so I turned it in February. Then I went to the Oscars, and I had written this afterword that I was not so happy with. I was like really in a rush. I wrote some grand conclusions, but I was like, yeah, I don't know. And then the slap happened, and I was there in the room, and I ended the night at the Vanity Fair party watching Will Smith dancing with his Oscar on the dance floor to Getting Jiggy with It, with a huge smile on his face. And I just thought, that is the end of the book. You know, that's this surreal, dark, crazy image of like the, you know, this man had just like opened up his soul in a way. In his best actor speech, we saw this like really raw human thing happen that was disturbing and violent. And then he won, and it was like this crazy turn of events. And then you see him, and it's just like, who cares? I've got an Oscar, you know, like it was the sort of there's the Oscars like this magical talisman or something that kind of it said so much, this image about like celebrity and the bubble and the, you know, what the Oscar kind of represents to people and the ridiculousness and darkness of it all. So on my revision, you know, once I basically told the editor, like, I'm rewriting the ending, and, you know, we need to get the slap in.
Oh my God, that's incredible. So just back up a little bit, but like when you actually, I mean, it sounded from the way you wrote about it in the book that it was hard to even tell what was happening watching it in real time. If you could just sort of back up and tell us like what it was like to actually see it or not see it.
Well, okay. So I was way up in the balcony in the cheap seats, and I'm very nearsighted. That's important for the story. This is a very and so I couldn't really see. I could see like two famous blobs, and like something happened, but I really didn't catch it. And however, I could hear perfectly. And when Will Smith shouted, keep my wife's name out your mouth, I heard it crystal clear, and I heard the anger in his voice, and I heard the F word, which I was like, I don't think you can say that on TV. This does not seem staged. So I could hear but not see. People watching from home could see but not hear, because there was a close-up shot. Right. However, they bleeped out what he said. So I immediately got 20 texts from people at work, friends, family members being like, what just happened? What was that? And I didn't really know. You know, even people there, it was like, what was that? Was that a comedic bit? Was that planned? Was that real? And so at that moment, I got out of my seat, I left, I ran down to the lobby, and I thought, okay, this is now something different. Like, I need to capture this chaos by interviewing people, finding out what different people saw. And this is now like a whole different story, which was exciting.
Yeah, so you just felt that adrenaline rush of being a reporter and thinking this just got good.
Oh yeah, and my phone was dying. It was like, I'm running around the lobby interviewing people, and then my boss David Ramnick calls me and is like, this is it, this is the story, this is what people are going to want to read about. I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm here, I'm doing it, don't worry, I'm on it. It was like, you know, I could sense like the pressure, like I have to capture this crazy moment everyone's going to be talking about.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things I was wondering listening to this, you know, what when you talk about Will Smith and just dancing there at the party holding the Oscar, and then you think about that very moving speech he gave when he got it, and there, you know, there's a part of maybe my more cynical side that said, are these guys just actors? You know, like, so was that speech real? Did he mean it, or do they
mean it? Didn't it? It felt like
it felt real, but
felt like
maybe he really deserved the Academy Award. He's like a great, I mean, you just wonder, right?
No, I felt like he was processing what had just happened to him in a very short amount of time. And when you think about it, this is the only instance I can think of someone reaching the absolute height of their career and then ruining their career at the same exact moment. Like, he had reached his high and his low. He won an Oscar, but he also knew he had done something, you know, very, very, very detrimental. And he said later that Denzel Washington told him, at your highest moment, that's when the devil comes for you. And so I think we saw him like wrestling with what had just happened. What was he capable of? And he was having to do it in front of the entire world. So then when I saw him later in the night, just like smiling and dancing with this Oscar, I thought this man is like in a fugue state. Like think of all the extreme emotions that he's been through just in this evening, like fury at Chris Rock, and then like guilt and shame and defensiveness and the thrill of winning an Oscar. And then by the end, it was like euphoria or something. I mean, it was fascinating. And I love those moments when like you see actual raw humanity play out in
It's great. So, okay, we're just going to do one more Will Smith thing, but I'm kind of like everybody, kind of riveted about it because, you know, it is like watching your worst nightmare play out in front of you. So I did watch the Chris Rock special this past weekend, which I'm assuming you must have. And it also was kind of like, what's this? And I wondered what your take on it is. What do you, I mean, it was like waiting up a year to just explode like that, or what's your feeling about it?
I mean, I thought it was pretty jaw-dropping how hard he came at Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, and he left it for the end. I mean, part of me just respects like the fact that he must have just slept on it for an entire year, dwelled on what he was going to say, found the biggest possible platform to say it, a live global Netflix event, saves it for the last 10 minutes, and then drops it all. I mean, there was just something so amazing about that.
I know, well, you're probably pretty plugged into all the reaction to it, which I wasn't. Like, how did people react to it that you've been seeing or hearing from?
I think there was a lot of like stunned reaction. I don't know, people didn't love it as a comedy special, maybe, like, but I think as an event, as like a sort of like the next round of this feud, it was pretty satisfying.
So I have a question here on the Q&A. Please share about your wonderful stalker story. Do you know what that is?
Oh, does that mean streaker?
Streaker, must be. Oh, streaker story. That must be it, because I didn't know. So tell us the streaker story. It is a great story.
Okay, yeah, I'm reading these interesting comments. Streaker, yes, okay. So the one big chapter that I cut from the book was that I wrote a long thing about the Oscar streaker of 1974. His name was Robert Opal. He was really fascinating. All anyone remembers about him really is that he streaked the Oscars, and David Niven was presenting, and he had this great zinger, which was, isn't it amazing that the only laugh this man will ever get in his life is for coming out here and showing us his shortcomings. So it was like one of those crazy Oscar moments that people remember. And but he turned out to have a really fascinating life before and after the streak. He was gay. He was very outrageous and risque. He was very funny. So once he got his 15 minutes of fame, he ran for president on a platform of nudity, and this was right around Watergate. So he said his slogan was not just another crooked dick. Then he moved to San Francisco and opened an erotic art gallery where he displayed the work of Margaret Mapplethorpe. He, sort of rubbed shoulders with people like Divine and John Waters. He was there during the Harvey Milk assassination. And then in 1979, 5 years after the streak, he was murdered in his gallery. And just, in the heat of like, so basically San Francisco having a meltdown over, the Harvey Milk stuff. So it was really fascinating history. I went out to San Francisco and went through court documents there was a kind of true crime element to this story. I talked to people who knew him, including the last living witness to his murder. I wrote this chapter, put it in the book, and my editor read it and said, this is really interesting, but I don't think this belongs in this book. And she was right, because it's not really about the history of Hollywood. It's not really about the Oscars. It's about like this crazy guy. It's actually more about the history of San Francisco and the gay liberation movement of the 70s. So I took it out of the book. which was long enough, and really hoped it would find a home. So I gave it to the New Yorker, and we turned it into a magazine piece, and it ran about a month ago.
Oh, I missed that. I'll have to find that. Thank
Yeah.
you. That is such a good story. I can't believe I didn't see that. I will go definitely look it up. So I got a question in the chat, which I am going to ask, because what is your personal favorite Oscar story besides the Streaker story that didn't get in? No, I'm kidding. What is your favorite
Didn't get
Oscar
in?
story? I know that's like asking who's your favorite child or something, but
I mean, the one that was really, really fun to write about in the book was the 1989 ceremony, which is remembered as the worst Oscars ever. This is the one where Rob Lowe was singing Proud Mary with Snow White in a replica of the Coconut Grove with dancing cocktail tables. It was this like 11-minute camp debacle. And for my 80s chapter, I decided to just write about that ceremony and the man who produced it, Alan Carr, who is this flamboyant gay producer who wore amazing caftans and threw incredible house parties, and he had produced Grease and La Cage aux Folles on Broadway and this Village People movie, Can't Stop the Music, and he dreamt his whole life of producing the Academy Awards, and then finally got to do it, and it was this fiasco that basically ruined his life and career. So it was really fun to write about because, you know, it can't be, it's ridiculous, but yet there's this kind of tragedy, this almost Icarus story at the center of it. And I don't know, I just really enjoyed working on it.
yeah, no, I love that as well, that chapter. And I also feel that you're really touching on something that I think is so good in the book, which is that, yeah, these are Hollywood people doing Hollywood things, but I think each one of these stories, and I think that's why people have loved the movies and love theaters, because you know, these people are putting themselves out there for one reason or another to go through all of these emotional things that all of us go through, but would never either be brave enough or stupid enough to reveal so publicly to people. And you just capture that so well in these stories. So you've had an Oscar pool for an awful long time, right? Don't you run an Oscar?
I used to run the office Oscar pool at the New Yorker. But that was like 10 years ago when I had more of a desk job. But I did run it for a couple of years.
And you haven't done that. So you stopped doing it because you got too busy?
Well, basically because I wasn't in the office regularly when I sort of, you know, I used to do like event planning for like the New Yorker Festival, and I had like a real desk job 5 days a week. But once I switched over to writing really full time, I don't go into the office as much, so there was no way to turn people's ballots. And then I got too busy because I started going to the Oscars every year and covering them. So
yeah,
it became a very busy work time of year for me. So I don't think they're doing it anymore. We got to get someone to bring it back.
Yeah. So I know this is a hateful question, but I have to do it. So do you have any thoughts on who's going to win this year?
Yeah, I will help you guys with your Oscar pool balance. I mean, Best Picture is actually weirdly easy this year. It seems to be Everything Everywhere All at Once, very far out ahead. I think if anything's going to beat it, it might be All Quiet on the Western Front. Director, a month ago I would have said Spielberg, but now I think the Daniels for Everything Everywhere. Best Actor is really hard. My gut tells me Austin Butler for Elvis. It could very well be Brendan Fraser for The Whale. It might be Colin Farrell for Banshees of Inisherin, but I just don't know. My personal favorite was Paul Mescal in After Sun, but I don't think he has a chance. Best Actress, I really am stumped. It's either Cate Blanchett or Michelle Yeoh. I have no clue. Okay, let's do the other actor ones. Best Supporting Actor is going to be Ke Huy Quan for Everything Everywhere. That seems pretty sewn up. And Best Supporting Actress is tough. A month ago, again, I would have said Angela Bassett. Then Jamie Lee Curtis started winning a bunch of stuff. But there's also a really good chance that Carrie Condon is her name from Banshees of Inisherin might elbow in. My instinct is still Angela Bassett, but I just don't know. That's a really tough one.
So are you basing this on seeing what kind of preliminary prizes people are winning, or like how do you gain this? How do you gain this?
Yeah, it's like who's winning what at like the SAG Awards, the BAFTAs, the this, the that. And then also kind of what people are saying. Like I listen to a lot of Oscar podcasts and, they're constant like prognostications throughout, every day. People are like, who's up, who's down? Da, 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 da. So it's really based on like what the mood is, like according to people who observe this professionally. And then you sort of see that, you get proof of that as these smaller awards roll out.
Okay, so we're sadly getting towards the end of our time, but before we say goodbye, I just want to make one more pitch. You can hear from everything Michael's been saying. You should buy this book. You will have such a good time, and you'll have something very cool to put on your bookshelf. But so tell everybody where you're going in 6 hours and what your next few days are going to be like.
I'm getting on a plane to LA at 6:30, and I'll be doing like pre-Oscars interviews, post-Oscars interviews. In the middle, I will be going to the Oscars, writing about it for the New Yorker the next day. And then I'm just going to collapse. I'll come home and I'll sleep for a month.
And what's your hope for the Oscars? I mean, are you hoping there's going to be another slap in the face or mixed up ballot, or do you just want something quiet this year?
I'm hoping for another on-stage assault. Like maybe Michelle Yeoh will kung fu Cate Blanchett.
That would be good. We'll be talking about that one for a year. Okay, yeah. I still have one or two more minutes, and I did want to ask you, because I love that, just going back to the beginning, I loved your Judd Hirsch piece. And I just wanted to know, it was so sweet and so good, and he sounds like so much fun. So how did that even happen? And what was that like?
I first saw The Fabelmans at the Toronto Film Festival, and it was, I mean, he just jumped off the screen, and he actually got exit applause on his last line at the premiere. So I was like, Judd Hirsch, he's going to be nominated for Best Supporting Actor. People are going to be talking about him in this movie. And also, he seems like a total kook. And that's the kind of person I like to write about for Talk of the Town. So I immediately, the next day, was like, asked the Fabelmans people, like, let's make this happen. I want to write a talk piece about Judd Hirsch. And then for Talk of the Town pieces, I usually have to come up with some kind of activity or excursion. And, he grew up in large part in the Bronx. So I thought, well, this would be good to, like, he plays like this Spielberg's like weird Jewish uncle who comes out of business. And I sort of wanted to ask him about his family and his upbringing and his sort of kooky relatives. And so we had a car drive us around all these different places he'd lived. And he was just absolutely nutty and wonderful. And like, the way he talks is so like bizarre, and like he spins in all these different directions. Yeah, I mean, I just thought he was totally charming and great. And I was so happy that he was nominated.
Yeah, no, and it really came across in the piece. It was so much fun. I loved him in that movie too. I thought he was just fabulous. So there was a question from somebody who wants to know, are you going to be doing any appearances in LA while you're out there for the Oscars?
Oh, like book events? No, I did a bunch like a week or two ago. I did a signing at the Academy Museum. This time I'm just like running around like crazy, like doing interviews, being at the Oscars. So right now I don't have anything planned, sadly.
No, thank you so much, Michael. Everybody who's watching today, you can read all about Michael's experience at the Oscars, I guess, in next week's New Yorker or the week after.
It'll be on the New Yorker website Monday afternoon.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Well, have fun as much as you can in the middle of all this. Thank you so much. This was really a pleasure.
Well, thank you to everyone who came, and thank you so much, Julie, for all your support.
Oh, my pleasure, and safe travels.
Thank you. Happy Oscars.
Thank you. Bye-bye.